do you have to pay for temporary accommodation when you go through the homeless application process? Now, that might seem like a really obvious question to some, but it's actually not quite so obvious because of the ways different councils work within their housing benefit and general kind of bureaucracy processes. And so basically the short answer is yes, you almost certainly will be liable for some kind of payment or rent, whatever you want to call it, if you're in council temporary accommodation. But the reason it might not seem obvious to you is that in many councils, just because it's easier or quicker for councils to do this, when you go and meet with them, you'll sign a bunch of forms, and often what you're actually signing is some kind of housing benefit entitlement form, and the claim then goes off, it gets paid directly to the landlord, so you never see it. You may not actually be aware it's happened, but it is happening, and the problem comes because sometimes there might be some kind of bureaucratic error, which means that payment is suspended and you're not aware of it, and so all of a sudden you get confronted by thousands of pounds worth of kind of arrears or some sort of bill. And that can obviously be terrifying and actually quite difficult to resolve in some cases. So I'm going to try and explain a couple of things just to make sense of this, just so you know where you stand. And ultimately the key thing is that if you're in temporary accommodation, you absolutely need to take the initiative and make sure all the rent payment is being dealt with in one way or another, so it's been taken care of. Because you can't rely on some kind of temp housing officer that happens to be in there that week to do it properly. And so a little bit about it, if you've been around a long time, you'll remember housing benefit. Housing benefit was largely replaced by universal credit, so now universal credit would generally pay your housing costs, your rent or whatever it would be, and that's dealt with through the Department of Work and Pensions, the DWP. But certain types of accommodation are still dealt with by housing benefit, and temporary accommodation is one of those types of accommodation. So what actually essentially happens is you make a homeless application, let's say there's a duty to provide accommodation. You'll often go to a sign up, you'll often even see a worker who's not even a council employee who's kind of doing it on behalf of the council. You get given a bunch of forms, you sign them all, you don't know what you're signing, and then that goes off into the ether. It goes across to the housing benefit department in the council, and they basically make the payment, or they kind of request further information or whatever. And so that payment, as I say, is often made direct to the landlord. One of the reasons confusion creeps in here is that councils provide accommodation kind of under different remits. And so one remit is going to be they have a statutory duty to do so under the homeless application process, Part 7 of the Housing Act, 1996 if you're interested. But there are other times where they might offer exactly the same accommodation unit, but this time it might be, let's say for example, part of the severe weather emergency provision, so the SWEP protocol, whatever it stands for. And that's kind of kicks in often in the winter. And some councils do use B&B hotel type accommodation for that SWEP provision. And so you might be in that provision again, probably the council's paying for it through the housing benefit department, but it's all kind of processed. You never see any of it really, you don't see any evidence it's actually happened. But let's say you then make a homeless application, and you might actually still be in exactly the same hotel bed space, but now because the system, the processes and the bureaucracy's changed, they might then expect you to do the housing benefit form, but crucially they won't tell you this, or if they do tell you it, it's kind of wrapped up in a whole bunch of information which is overwhelming you, which you're not going to take in all in one go. So I guess it's useful, again, just kind of go back to basics. If you're in this situation, if the council is providing accommodation to you under any kind of arm of its remit or whatever, then it would be sensible to email whatever contact detail you've got at the council, even if it's a generic, housing@bedford.gov.uk or something, and basically just send that email off and just say, look, I'm in this accommodation, can someone confirm that I don't need to do anything in order to, to make sure the rent payment is processed? So if you're doing that and they mess up, you've got evidence that you actually took initiative, you took responsibility for it, and it's not your error. You can show that it was not your error that led to that payment being failed or whatever it would be. So that's something you need to be aware of, and I guess along the same lines there might be other kind of payments or top-ups or stuff that you might need to know about. So council should tell you this, and really council should tell you this verbally in a way which you're likely to retain, because as I say, you're swamped with information. It's a completely new process a lot of the time. You don't know what's going on, it's not very transparent at the best of times. A good council officer will basically sit you down and just kind of lay out and probably write down, as they're doing it, just some notes and bullet points of what it is you need to do. So the first part of the answer to this question is yes, you are liable, yes, you are responsible for the rent payments. The council may well pay it, but you need to make sure that's happening, and it will just depend on the council. Even within the council it would often be different. I've seen with Bedford many times when the normal default process is that you go in to the council at some point, sign loads of forms, one of which is the housing benefit form, and then that all gets up and running on its own. But other times that process will break down, and essentially what often happens is the person in temporary accommodation gets an angry letter from the council saying you owe us £2,500, you need to pay it immediately, and that can obviously set you off in a right old having a bad day if nothing else. So you need to make sure that that's all kind of up and running. The second part of the question is a little bit more interesting in that, so let's say you can't afford the rent. So let's say, they're offering hotel accommodation or some sort of nightly let accommodation. Often that cost will be ridiculous. And I've seen many times when councils, let's say you're working, the council officer will say, you're working, we can't get housing benefit for you, therefore, you're not going to be able to afford temporary accommodation, so you need to find something else. Now that's not lawful, because every single offer of accommodation that the council provides under Part 7 of the Housing Act 1996, which is the fancy way of saying the homeless application process, basically has to be suitable, and that kind of is about standards. It can cover location, that sort of thing, but it does certainly cover the idea of affordability. So whatever accommodation the council provides under their statutory duties has to be affordable. It has to take into account your current income, you work in, it might be full-time, it might be part-time, but they need to actually make sure that what they're offering you is affordable. And it's a little bit weird, but often what that means is the council will have to pay a top-up themselves out of another budget that isn't housing benefit, because housing benefits are quite rigid, it's all set from central government and they can only do certain things. But as I say, the duty to provide suitable accommodation is paramount. It trumps everything else. And so if you're in work and you can only, let's say, claim £10 a week housing benefit or something like that because of your work hours and the amount you're working, the amount you're earning, then the council have to essentially top up that difference, because the accommodation they have to give you has to enable you to be able to afford the essentials of life, which is your food, your gas, electric, all the kind of stuff that would be normal, assuming you're paying gas and electric, but you know what I mean, so clothing, travel, that sort of thing. You need to still be able to afford all that stuff whilst you're in their accommodation, and it can kind of get quite complicated, as I say, because I'll give you an example of a case. I've talked about it elsewhere on this channel in a different video about something else actually, but in this case there was a victim of domestic abuse who jointly owned their accommodation. So I think they owned their home outright. But even if there was still mortgage payments still going, the same principle would apply. And because so she fled domestic abuse, and the council had a duty to provide suitable accommodation. But because she had this huge asset, so probably she probably essentially had about £200,000 worth in assets tied up in this home. But obviously it's not straightforward to kind of get out of that arrangement because you're married, and maybe come back to that in a minute. But basically, so she wasn't able to claim housing benefit at all because it's capped. I can't remember what it's capped at. Something like 16,000 for a single person, I think. But don't quote me on that. Check it out yourself. And yet the council still had an absolute duty under Section 188 to provide interim temporary accommodation. Interim accommodation is a technical term for it, so emergency accommodation. And because she was on universal credit, she didn't have any income. In fact, she had no income at all at the start. She was reliant on her husband. The council had to therefore essentially offer that accommodation to her at what's called a peppercorn rent. So I think it was like £1 a month or something. It's like a nominal fee, which is basically nothing. And the actual there was essentially a different department of the council that was paying that. So whereas housing benefit would normally pay for temporary accommodation costs, in this case it went through to a different budget. It was probably the housing options budget, and they were the ones who were having to top up this rent. And it's a very difficult situation for councils to be in, because when you're in that situation where you're legally homeless, even though you own your own home jointly with the perpetrator of abuse, let's say, in order to force the sale of that home, that is years worth of legal wranglings, family law solicitors, divorce solicitors, all the rest of it getting involved, and essentially often survivors in that situation won't have money up front to pay for legal costs to kind of get the process started. So it's incredibly difficult, and that means that councils can often end up paying for people's temporary accommodation in this way for many years, because there is no other alternative. They have an absolute duty to provide suitable accommodation. The person can't afford it through no fault of their own, and so that's kind of the situation that they get stuck into. And I guess councils would be sensible to be maybe a little bit more creative about how they potentially even pay some of the legal costs up front to get a family law solicitor involved to get the divorce going, because actually that might save them tens of thousands of pounds over many years if nothing else works out. So, and also on the topic of temporary accommodation or interim accommodation that's unaffordable because of someone's savings, I'm aware of a case, I don't know the details of it. It was a Just Us case, but it wasn't my case, so John Allen ran it. And basically a guy became homeless, I'm not quite sure what the circumstances were, and when he initially approached the council, he had more than £16,000. So I'm pretty sure the interim duty to accommodate was triggered, but what he was told was, you can't claim housing benefit, therefore we can't provide you temporary accommodation, or something like that. I'm not exactly sure of the detail. And what actually happened was he basically just stayed in a hotel and ran down his savings. Now you might think that's, you know, that's a foolish thing to do, but there were other circumstances going on. I think there were some mental health issues that were going on as well. And so it wasn't until he ran out of money altogether that, you know, that he actually went back to the council, and then they accommodated him and got him sorted out. And I know that John ran a complaint basically saying he should have been advised, if nothing else, when he first went to the council, that once his savings went under that £16,000 threshold, they would be able to pay for temporary accommodation costs. Now, as I say, there's probably some gaps in that kind of case, but I think there was some compensation awarded. It wasn't the full 16,000, I don't think, but there was some compensation awarded, just to recognise that actually when you go to a council, they are supposed to give you competent legal advice, and if they tell you some nonsense that just doesn't make sense and ends up kind of screwing you over, then potentially they might be liable for that. So that's something just kind of worth bearing in mind as well. As always, if you've got questions about this, stick it in the comments section anonymously. Don't name yourself, don't say it's about yourself, just say it's about a hypothetical person. So a question that starts, what if someone was, is a great way of starting a question on this channel. And if it's simple, I'll respond to it straight away in writing. But if it's a little bit more interesting and a bit more complicated, I'll take it to the next weekly live stream, which we do every Thursday evening at 7:30. You don't need to watch it live. You just watch the recording in the live section of the channel. And if you find this stuff useful, I'm just going to do a little bit of a push on YouTube at the moment, so please do like and share and subscribe to it and all the rest of it. If you subscribe, you will get notifications of new videos, so there is, I guess, something in it for you, but not a lot. I appreciate that. But yeah, I think the live streams, I certainly enjoyed doing them. They're kind of some regulars coming back, and I'm hoping it's a really good place just to explore things in a lot more detail. So we've got two solicitors and then myself and Shannon just kind of talking about different things, and you know, we're not going to know everything, but we have a pretty good stab at things.